Alright, we're going to put our knowledge of functions to practice now with the ATM script that needs to be done this week. So this is going to use the functions and all the stuff that we learned with functions, and you'll be able to see kind of how that works in a real life situation. I think this is the information that was given to you by Codio. You don't have to modify this. I do want to just point out here that this cast to a float is redundant because that is the same thing. Python will actually recognize this as a float, so you don't have to have the cast in there, but if that's what they give you, then go ahead and leave it. It doesn't hurt anything. Alright, so the first thing is I always recommend defining functions first. That way you kind of have a map of what you need to do, what you can do. So we're going to go in and start defining our functions first. The first one is we'll do the print balance function. That one's nice and simple. So the requirements say that when the print function is called, then it should just print the account balance. Okay, so first thing you need to do is define a function. And functions are defined using the def keyword and then a name. And since this is going to print the balance, we'll just call it print balance. Okay. Again, functions should have a name that is descriptive, kind of describes what it does inside the function. So that way it's just easier to read, and you can look at what's going on, or you can look at the function name and know what it should be doing. Alright, now every time you define a function, it has to have these parentheses, whether there's information in it or not. If there's nothing in it, you can just say it's empty. So this is an empty parameter list, and I'm saying it's empty because I don't need any extra information in order to do what I need to in the function. So this is, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So this function is supposed to print the account balance. So we're just going to call the print function from inside this function, and we're just going to print the account balance. Okay, now I can do this because this account balance is defined up here on line 3. Since it's defined right here and it's outside of the function, any code that is below that line actually has access to this function, or to this variable. So I can call it here, account balance, and it will actually reference the value that's inside here. And that's just because of something called the scope, variable scope. And I'm not going to get into that into too much detail, but basically it just means that since it's defined up here on line 3, any code below it, and because it's not defined inside a function or inside any kind of an if statement or whatever, because it's defined here, then all the code that's below it will be able to see it and read it. Okay, so by doing this, it'll be able to print the account balance that it has access to right here. All right, and that's it for the function. The next function was the deposit, right? So we're going to deposit some amount. Now in this case, I am going to need to specify a parameter here. And that's, remember, the parameters inside these parentheses, when they're defined, that's just extra information that you need in order to carry out the function, to do what you need to inside the function. So whenever you call a deposit, you need to tell it how much to deposit, right? So I'm going to just define a variable called amount. You can call it whatever you want, whatever makes sense to you. This needs to be it should be a new variable name, okay, one that hasn't been used. So I shouldn't use account balance here because it's already been defined up here, and there may be some confusion as to which one is which. So I'm going to use a different variable that I haven't used yet. Okay, and we're going to call it amount. So every time this function is called, this amount, it needs to be added to the account balance, and print it out. And the way that Codio wants you to display this is kind of like this. Okay. So the deposit was some amount, and the current balance is, well, it's going to be the new balance. So what we can do, and I'm going to use the formatting stuff that I've showed you before, and I'll bring it up again here. You use the % sign to specify that you are going to substitute this with a variable value, and then the F means it's a float. Okay, so we're going to do that for both of these, %F, because we're going to have the amount is going to go here, right? Deposit was some amount, and then the current balance is, and then we're going to do some calculation to get this variable, or to get this placeholder replaced. Okay, now if you remember, when you use this, especially with like currencies, you want it to be 2 decimal points, two decimal places after the decimal point. So to specify that, we're going to use a decimal point and a 2 to specify we want 2 after the decimal point. And we're going to do that on both of these. Alright, and now that we have our placeholders set up, okay, we need to tell it what to substitute. So in this first substitution, we want it to be the value that was passed in, the amount. Okay, we need a comma to separate them, and then the second value to substitute is going to be the account balance plus the amount. And remember, since I'm just reading this value, I can, and it was defined up here on line 3, all the code below it can read it. So I'm going to do account balance plus the amount. Okay, so I know it looks like there's 3 variables in here, but it's only 2 evaluations. So when this is running, Python is going to evaluate this amount, and that's going to pull whatever value is inside here. And then there's a comma, so now it's going to evaluate this whole thing, the account balance plus the amount, and that's going to resolve to one number, and that's going to be replaced into here, or it's going to be substituted into this spot. Okay, so that does it for the deposit function. The next function is going to be the withdrawal. Alright, and again, whenever we have a withdrawal function call, we want to make sure we know how much to withdraw. Okay, now this is going to be very similar. The only difference in this case is that we want to make sure that we're not going to withdraw too much money. So to do that, we just want to make sure that the amount does not exceed, so the amount to withdraw does not exceed the account balance. If it exceeds the account balance, then we're not even going to do the subtraction on it. We're just going to print a message that says, you know, insufficient funds, basically. Otherwise, if the amount to withdraw is less than or equal to the account balance, then we can go ahead and perform the transaction, if you will. So in this case, since we're making a decision, we're going to want an if statement. Okay, so if the amount is greater than our account balance, and remember, I don't need that to be defined in the parameters, because in this function I have access to the account balance that was defined way up here on line 3. Okay, so if the amount is greater than the account balance, that means that the user is trying to withdraw too much money. So we need to print a message, and the message is just going to be something to this effect. Let's try this again here. Alright, so and then we're going to put a placeholder into both of these spots where we want the values to be replaced. And to specify that we want it to be 2 decimal points, we use decimal point 2. Alright, so now our placeholders are set up just like they were before, and actually I think, let me check something here. Withdraw, I want to make sure, do we need the withdraw amount? Ensure they use it, yeah. So we want to have the $sign in front. Alright, so we've got our placeholders set up, so now we need to specify what we want to be substituted into those placeholders. So the first one is the amount, and the next one is going to be just the account balance. We don't have to do any calculations to the account balance because all we're doing is reading what the current balance is. We're not doing a transaction on it. Okay? So if the amount is greater than the account balance, then we print the message that says, sorry, can't do that, not enough money. Else, or otherwise, we can go ahead and perform the transaction. I'm going to do something to this effect. Copy and paste is great. Withdraw amount was boom, boom, boom. So we've got our placeholder set up. We've got that placeholder set up. There's the amount, and then instead of doing the account balance plus the amount, we're going to do the account balance minus the amount. And the last function to do is print, let's see, I think it's something to this effect. Alright, so this was the final, if the user types in the command to quit, then this is what's supposed to be displayed. Just a quick little summary sort of thing. This is thank you for banking with us. Alright, so all the functions are defined, okay, but so let's see. Remember that since they're just defined, if I try to run this, nothing happened. You see there's no output. It has print statements in here all over the place, but it doesn't print anything because we didn't call the functions. Okay, all we did was define them. We said, hey, this is a cool function, this is what I want it to do, but it doesn't do anything until we actually call upon it, right? Imagine being in a room with a bunch of people, everybody's got a different name, and somebody tells you, hey, when I call your name, I want you to jump up and do 10 jumping jacks, right? Then you just kind of sit there and wait until somebody calls your name. Once your name is called, then you jump up and do the 10 jumping jacks. That's the same sort of thing. I'm telling this, hey, this is your name, print balance, right? And this is what you're going to do if somebody calls your name. You're just going to print the value that's inside this variable. And so Python defines it right here. Print balance sits there and says, all right, cool, well, I know what I'm supposed to do. And now I'm just waiting for somebody to call me and tell me to do it. All right, so now if I were to do print balance, don't need that, different language. Now if I run this, what it should do, it's going to define the print balance, it's going to define the deposit, the withdraw, it's going to define all these functions, and then I'm going to actually call it. I'm going to call this one, and it should print out the account balance. Oops. I have to not have that selected. There we go. So you'll notice now it prints out the account balance. Okay, and that's because I called the function, right, by using its name and the parentheses. Okay, now I also want to show you what will happen if you don't use the parentheses on it. What it's going to do is something completely, if you ever see this, that means you're calling your function incorrectly, right? Function print balance at 0x00, all this weird number that means nothing to you. Basically what this is it's just, it prints out the memory location of where this function is located. So remember we defined it up here, and that just takes this block of code, puts it into a spot in memory, and which is right here, and Python keeps that keeps a record of that, and whenever it's called, then it finds that memory address and executes the code there. But in this case, it didn't call it, it just said, hey, give me the address where this function is located. Okay, so you'll notice nothing happened, right? It printed this weird value. So if you see that, then you know you're probably calling your function incorrectly. So in order to call a function, you have to have the parentheses at the end of it. That's what tells Python, I want to execute the function with this name, okay? And then any arguments inside here, if necessary, okay? So that's what a function call is. So it's important to know the terminology and the difference between defining a function and calling a function. Okay, it's very important, and that's kind of the difference. Is when you're defining it, you're telling Python, hey, this is what can be done whenever somebody calls this name, and then calling the function is actually doing its name and passing in some kind of an amount or passing in any arguments based on the parameters that are defined. Okay, hope that's not too confusing, but we'll see a couple examples here as we move on. And since now we're going to actually put in the logic to call these functions depending on the information. So first thing, after we define all our functions, we need to get the input from the user. Okay, so we need to use the input function, and we're gonna, I don't know, ask the customer for something, right? So let's try this here. Alright, so this is going to be the input function, and it's going to, since we're specifying a string inside the parentheses, it's called an argument to this function. Since we're specifying an argument to the input function, this is actually going to be printed first, and then Python is going to get whatever value is typed in or sent in by Codio, and it's going to return that. So since it's returning a value, we want to store that somewhere. So let's say, I don't know, user response, right? So now this is going to, Python's going to go out and get the information, get the whatever's typed in by the user or sent in by Codio in this case, and it's going to assign it to the variable user response. Now, it always comes in as a string, okay? So if you ever need to get a number, which we'll need to do later, we'll have to handle that accordingly. So now, once this runs, we should have a value in here, and it's going to be either D for deposit, it's going to be W for withdrawal, I hate the way that's spelled, or it's going to be B for print balance. Okay, so I'll leave that there just for reference. So now we need to make a decision, right? Based on the user response. So we're going to say, well, we have a decision to make. If the user response is equal to D for deposit, right, we're going to do the deposit stuff there. Else, if the user response is equal to W, then we're going to do the withdrawal stuff here, and then else if the user response is equal to B, we're going to print the balance. Alright, so now let's just replace this stuff with some real code. Alright, so the deposit, well, if they're going to deposit something, we want to know how much to deposit, right? So now we'll create another variable and call it deposit amount. And then we're going to get a value from the user. And let's see, and it should be something like how much, I don't know, how much would you like to deposit? Something to that effect. If you're running this through Codio, you may have to make sure that the prompt is correct. Otherwise, it's not going to pass. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's kind of my guess. So now we have an input, right? Some value that's going to be returned after we prompt the user for the deposit amount. Now remember, since this always returns a string, as soon as this runs, deposit amount is now a string type. Okay, we can't do math on a string type, so we need to convert this to a numeric type. And since the amount could be, could have decimal points, we want to make sure that we keep it the decimal point type. So what this is going to do is it's going to return some kind of a string representation of an amount to deposit, and then it's going to convert that to a float type, and then it's going to assign it inside this deposit amount. Okay? So now here's where the magic happens. So remember, I have a function defined up here called deposit amount. So that just means that every time I call this, call its name and tell it some kind of an amount, then it's going to run the code that's inside here and do some cool calculations. So let's call the function. Remember to call the function, you just use its name, the parentheses, and then if it has parameters defined, you need to supply some kind of information into that. So in this case, it needs an amount value. Okay, so we just got an amount value from the user, so we're going to pass that value in. And let me kind of explain how this is working, because this might be a little confusing. You say, wait a minute, there's two different names, right? There's deposit amount here and then amount here. So at this point in the code, deposit amount is a variable that points to some value that was typed in by the user. It could be any number, but it's stored inside this variable. Okay, so to access it, all you need is its name. So you call its name, and you get the amount that's inside there. Okay, so what this does, when you call the function deposit, and then you specify this variable name here, what Python does is it goes and it finds the value that is located inside the variable deposit amount. Okay, it gets that value. So let's say that the user typed in 10.75. It's going to replace deposit amount with 10.75. Then it's going to call the function, right, with that amount. So it's going to jump all the way up to here and start running code up here. Now, because the value at inside deposit amount was supplied, it's going to replace, or it's going to set this variable amount equal to the value that is defined here. Okay, so if I were to type in 1.75 or any number for that matter, that's the same kind of thing. So it just takes this value and assigns it to the variable up here in the function call, in the parameter list. Okay, and in this case I want it to be whatever the value was that was typed in. So it's just a little bit of swapping and then assigning again. So it's two different names, but it is all the same amount, if you will. And that's just because down here, excuse me, deposit amount is being defined, but when you come up here, deposit amount, the variable, it doesn't know what that is inside this function. So it has to use the amount. So it's just different ways of assigning. I don't know, I hope I'm not making it too confusing, but whatever value is assigned in here is then going to be assigned in here every time this function is called. Okay? And that's it. So then that's going to call, it's going to run the code that's in here, and that's done. So now for the withdrawal, it's basically the same thing. We're going to do withdrawal amount, creating a new variable, and then we're going to do the same sort of structure up here as we did for the deposit. How much would you like to withdraw? Okay, so same thing. As soon as this runs, withdrawal amount is going to be some kind of a number. Could have decimal points, it could not have decimal points, it doesn't matter. But it needs to be a number. And that's being stored here, so now we just need to call our withdrawal function, right? The same way we called our deposit function, and so that's with its name. withdrawal, and then we need to give it some kind of an argument because the parameter is required or is defined here, and it's required. So we're going to pass it in the amount that we just the amount that we just got from the user. And once it calls it, it's going to execute this function, and then whatever value is inside the withdrawal amount is now going to be set inside the amount variable just within this function. Okay? As soon as it finishes this function, it's going to jump back to where it was and continue execution after that if there's anything to do. Okay, so that's kind of the power of functions, is you can just call them whenever you need to, and it just jumps out, does the function, and then comes right back to where it was and continues on. All right? And then lastly, if the user types in B for print balance, well, we don't need to get any extra information, so we're just going to print balance. And remember the parentheses, those are required even if you're not sending any information over. Oh, and you know what? There's also a Q for quit. So we're going to have to do one more of those. But yeah, so this now, if it gets to this point, let's say, so it's going to start right here. After it defines all the functions, it's going to start here. It's going to get some value from the user. Let's say they type in B. Okay. It's going to check this. If user response equals D, it does not. And it's going to check this. Does it equal W? No, it does not. Does it equal B? Yes, it does. It's going to call the function. So it's going to run all the way back up here to the top, and it's going to execute this code. Right? It's going to print the account balance, which will be whatever value is stored here. And then as soon as it prints that, right, it's going to execute this line, and then it's not going to start executing here again. It's just going to jump right back to where it was, and it's going to execute after that. All right, and then we need to do one more that I forgot about. If user response equals Q, then we had that last one. What was it? Print summary. So same exact thing. I don't need to supply it any information as an argument because it doesn't have anything inside the parameter list. And that should be it. So we'll kind of walk through this one more time here, just so you can see what's going on, and hopefully it'll start to click a little more. So as soon as you start running this, it's going to start at the top. Okay. So line 1, it's going to run that. It's going to assign some value to account balance. Then it's going to come down here and start defining our function. So it's going to define the function print balance, which just says, hey, I'm creating this function. It's going to have this functionality, whatever's inside here. And so every time this is called, just go ahead and run this code. Right? Then it's going to, once it finishes defining that one, then it's going to come down and define this one. Right? Do the same thing. Okay? If here's your name, here's what you're going to do every time you're called. Here's your name and what you're going to do every time you're called. And then notice how, I know these functions are pretty small. They've one line here, one line here. This one's got 4 lines. A function can have as many lines as it needs. Okay? It doesn't have to be only a 1-line function. It doesn't have to only be 2 lines or whatever. It can be as many lines as it needs to be. Just keep in mind the indentations. Okay? So then it comes down here and it defines this print summary. It says here's your name, here's what you're going to do every time, and then it comes to here and now it starts actually doing some work. It's going to create a variable. It's going to go out and get some value from the user. What would you like to do? They're going to enter one of these values, hopefully, and then it's going to check the value that they entered, and we're going to call the correct function depending on what they entered. So it's going to check here. If the user typed in D, we'll then go ahead and ask them how much to deposit, and then call the function passing in the amount that they want to deposit. As soon as that happens, it's going to jump all the way up to the top wherever you defined the deposit function, and it's going to assign the value that was supplied in the argument to the variable amount, and then it's going to go ahead and execute this line of code. Okay, and that's going to print, and remember the placeholders are replaced with the values that are inside here. And as soon as that's finished executing, it jumps all the way back down to the bottom, and it continues. Now, since these are elifs, what's going to happen is if this executes, if it is D, it's not even going to check these. It's just going to skip, boom, all the way to the end. You could do just an if, okay? Oops. that would work as well. It's just a tiny bit less efficient, and the reason is, let's say the user does type in D. It's going to check this if the user types in D, and then it's going to execute this. Then as soon as that's all done, it's going to come here and it's going to say, all right, if the user typed in W, then it's going to do this check. But since they already typed in D, you don't even have to check this, right? You know that if that's D, it couldn't be W, B, or Q, right? So I like to just put these as elifs. That way it's just a tiny bit more efficient. And for large applications or code that's running a lot, that will make a difference, but in this case it probably won't, at least not a noticeable difference. But yeah, so then what's going to happen is, let's say they did not enter D, let's say they entered W instead. It's going to do this check first. That's not true, so it's going to jump down and it's going to do this check. That is true, so now it's going to run this code and get some value, say how much do you want to withdraw, and then it's going to call the function withdraw, passing in the amount that was just received. And once that's done, it jumps back up here to the to where you define the withdraw function, set the amount equal to the value that was passed in as the argument, and then it's going to execute these codes, these lines of code. So if the amount is greater than the account balance, it's going to print, hey, you can't do that. Otherwise, if the amount is not greater than the account balance, it's going to go ahead and perform the transaction, printing the result. As soon as that's done, it jumps back down to the bottom, wherever it was, it remembers where it left off, and then it continues on. So now let's say they did not enter W, instead they entered B. So it does this check, that's false, this check, that's false. Now it does this check. Since they entered B, it goes ahead and calls this function, which is going to jump up to the top where it has print balance defined, and it's going to execute this code inside. Okay, once that's done, it jumps back down to the bottom and continues on. Okay, and finally, let's say they entered Q, so it's going to do this check, false, so it's not going to run these lines, it's going to skip those. It runs this check, that's false, so it skips these lines. It does this check, that's false, it skips this line. And then finally it checks here, that's true. So then what it's going to do is it's going to call this function, right? And that's going to jump up here to this print summary definition, and it's going to execute this code now because we called it. Okay, as soon as it finishes executing there, it's going to jump back down to the bottom and continue on, nothing left, so the file is done. Okay, that should take care of that. I hope to have made functions clearer for you as far as defining and calling them with parameters and without parameters. And I hope I helped to make the logic a little bit more clear for you as well. So yeah, that's functions. They're very powerful and extremely important. So hopefully you'll get a good grasp on how to use them.